Jedediah plunged the shovel into the hard-packed earth. It was good ground for a grave, his own. The soil gave way with a satisfying grit, a finality he had come to crave. For 2 weeks he had worked on it, an hour after sunrise, an hour before sunset. The dimensions were precise, measured against his own weary height. 6 feet deep, 3 feet wide, 7 feet long. Room enough for a man and the ghosts he carried. His homestead was a lonely speck carved into the high crags, a place you didn't find by accident. It clung to the mountainside like a stubborn hawk's nest, overlooking a sprawling valley that was, to him, another world. He hadn't been down there in 9 years. The path was overgrown, the memories more so. Inside his cabin, a thick layer of dust coated everything that belonged to her. A rocking chair, a small shelf of books, a sewing basket with a needle still threaded. He lived around these silent monuments, a groundskeeper in a museum of his own making. The wind was picking up, a low moan that snaked through the pines. It carried the scent of rain and something else, something metallic and wrong. He paused, shovel halfway to the mound of dark earth, and listened. The only sounds for years had been the wind, the cry of a distant eagle, and the steady rhythmic beat of his own regret. This was different. He shielded his eyes, his gaze sweeping the jagged line of rocks that formed the only approach to his property. And then he saw it, a flash of white against the gray stone, like a patch of snow that had forgotten the season. It moved, stumbled, then fell. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. Jedediah's first instinct was a cold, hard command from the part of him that had survived. Do nothing. Trouble was a traveler. Let it pass. He had built this fortress of solitude precisely to keep the world and its bleeding heart out. He turned back to his grave, his knuckles white on the wooden handle of the shovel. Another scoop of earth, another step closer to peace. But the image was burned into his mind. The white fabric, the way the figure had crumpled like a discarded letter. A storm was coming. The sky was bruised purple and gray, the clouds churning. To leave someone out in that, it was a death sentence. He grunted, a sound of profound irritation. The ghost in the rocking chair seemed to stir. He could almost hear her voice, the one he spent every day trying to forget, chiding him. "Jedediah, you are still a good man." He spat on the ground. "No, I'm not," he muttered to the wind, but his feet were already moving. He threw the shovel down, the clang of metal on rock echoing his own internal discord. He grabbed the old rifle from its pegs by the door, not out of concern for the stranger, but out of habit. In this life, you never opened your door, real or metaphorical, unarmed. He moved with a stiff-legged gait, his old bones complaining, but his steps were sure-footed over the treacherous terrain. He knew every rock, every dip, every loose patch of shale. As he drew closer, the white shape resolved itself into a woman. She was wearing what was left of a wedding dress, the lace torn and smeared with mud and something dark red. Blood. She was unconscious, face down. Her hair, a cascade of dark brown, was matted against her cheek. Jedediah knelt, the rifle held loosely in one hand. He nudged her shoulder gently. "Ma'am?" She didn't stir. Her breathing was shallow, a faint whisper against the rising howl of the wind. He could see a nasty gash on her temple, and her arm was bent at an angle that made his stomach clench. Broken. He scanned the path behind her. No tracks but her own, scuffed and desperate. No horse. She had come on foot. From where? The nearest town, Harmony Creek, was a 2-day walk for a healthy man. For her, it was an impossibility. He was faced with the clearest choice he'd had in nearly a decade. Drag her inside, into his sanctuary, and shatter the silence. Or walk away, get back to his grave, and let the storm handle it. It would be easy. No one would ever know. He could have his peace. He looked down at her. The delicate lace of her dress, now a ruined testament to some terrible event, reminded him of another dress, packed away in a cedar chest at the foot of his bed. He closed his eyes. The ghost was there again, her hand on his shoulder. With a groan that was part pain and part surrender, he laid the rifle aside. He carefully, gently, gathered the woman into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, fragile as a broken bird. The storm was no longer just coming. It was here. The first cold drops of rain began to fall as he carried her back toward the cabin, away from the grave and toward a trouble he could already feel settling deep in his bones. He laid her on his own cot, the only bed in the small cabin that was regularly used. For a moment, he just stood there, dripping rainwater onto the floorboards, a stranger in his own home. The woman's presence was an explosion of color and chaos in his monochrome world. The scent of her, rain, pine, and blood, filled the small space, chasing away the familiar smell of dust and old sorrow. He worked with a grim, practiced efficiency that felt alien to him now, like a language he hadn't spoken in years but still understood. He lit a second lantern, flooding the room with a warm, flickering light that made the shadows dance. He fetched the wooden box from under his cot, the one marked with a faded red cross. Inside were rolls of bandage, bottles of carbolic acid, a bone saw, and sutures, tools of a life he had tried to bury. He cut away the sleeve of the ruined dress from her broken arm. The bone had snapped clean through the forearm. Setting it would be hell for her, and for him. He started with the gash on her temple, cleaning it gently with a damp cloth. She moaned, her eyelids fluttering. Her eyes were a startling lucid green, wide with terror and confusion. Where am I?" she whispered, her voice rough. "You're safe," Jedediah said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "You collapsed. I brought you in from the storm." She tried to sit up, a raw panic in her eyes, but gasped as a jolt of pain shot through her arm. He put a firm, steady hand on her shoulder. "Easy now. You're hurt bad. Your arm's broken." Tears welled in her eyes, carving clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. "He's coming," she choked out. "You have to let me go. He'll find me here. He'll hurt you." "Who's coming?" Jedediah asked, his voice low and calm as he began to prepare a splint from 2 pieces of kindling and strips of clean cloth. My husband," she said, the word tasting like poison. Cain Blackwood." Jedediah paused. He knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew the Blackwoods. Silas Blackwood was a cattle baron who ran the valley below like his own private kingdom, a man whose wealth was matched only by his reputation for ruthlessness. His son, Cain, was said to be even worse, a cruel, arrogant man with a taste for violence. "We were married this morning," the woman continued, her voice trembling. It wasn't a choice. My father owed him money. It was a transaction. When he touched me, I ran. I hit him with a fireplace poker and I just ran." She looked at Jedediah, her green eyes pleading. "He won't stop. He'll see it as an insult to his name. He will hunt me to the ends of the earth." "Let him," Jedediah said, his focus on wrapping the splint. "He won't find you here." The wind howled outside, rattling the single window pane in its frame. Rain lashed against the roof in a furious torrent. The storm was a shield, for now. He finished setting and splinting the arm. She bit her lip to stifle a scream, her body rigid with pain, but she didn't make a sound. When he was done, she slumped back against the pillow, exhausted and pale. "What's your name?" he asked, packing his medical kit away. "Ilara," she said softly. "Jedediah." He gave her a tin cup of water, and she drank it greedily. He moved to the stone fireplace, adding another log. The flames leaped, casting a warm glow over the stark room. For the first time, Ilara seemed to see her surroundings. The dusty rocking chair, the single shelf of untouched books, the profound, oppressive solitude of the place. "You live here alone," she stated. Not a question. "I do." "For how long?" "Long enough," he said, his tone ending that line of conversation. He sat in his own worn chair by the fire, the rifle resting across his lap. He didn't plan to sleep. He would watch. He would wait. He had invited the world in, and now he had to stand guard at the door. Hours passed. The storm raged, a symphony of chaos that perfectly mirrored the turmoil inside the cabin. Ilara drifted in and out of a restless, pain-filled sleep. Jedediah sat like a statue of granite, listening. Every crack of thunder sounded like a gunshot. Every gust of wind sounded like a shouted name. It was just before dawn, when the storm had begun to tire itself out, that he heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the weather. It was faint at first, almost lost in the din. Hoofbeats. Several horses, moving with purpose up the treacherous path to his cabin. He rose silently, moving to the window and peering through a crack in the wooden shutter. Down the trail, he saw them. 3 riders, their forms dark against the pre-dawn gloom. They were being led by a man on a big black stallion, a man who sat in the saddle with an unearned arrogance. Even from a distance, Jedediah could feel the menace radiating from him. Cain Blackwood. Jedediah turned to Ilara. She was already awake, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to steal the air from the room. She had heard it too. "It's him," she breathed, shrinking back into the cot. "Oh God, it's him." "Get down," Jedediah commanded in a low voice, his words sharp and clear. "Stay away from the window and don't make a sound." He checked the load in his rifle. Old reflexes, buried under 9 years of dust, were waking up. A cold calm settled over him, the kind that only comes when you've faced death enough times to know its habits. He wasn't the hermit digging his grave anymore. He was the man who had put men in them. The rider stopped 100 yards from the cabin. "Alara!" The voice was a whip crack, slicing through the rain. "I know you're in there, you filthy runaway. I can smell you. Get out here now and I'll make it quick." Jedediah didn't answer. He watched them, calculating. 3 of them. 1 of him. But he had the high ground. He had the cover. And he had something they didn't. He knew this mountain like the back of his own hand. "Old man!" Kane shouted again, his voice dripping with condescension. "We tracked her right to your door. Send out my wife and we'll let you live out your miserable days in this pigsty. Try to be a hero and we'll burn it to the ground with you inside." Jedediah remained silent. He moved from the window to the heavy wooden door, sliding the thick iron bolt into place. It made a solid, definitive sound, an answer in itself. Outside, Kane laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. "Have it your way, then." Jedediah heard the click of hammers being pulled back on their pistols. He looked over at Alara. She was huddled on the floor, but her eyes weren't just filled with fear anymore. There was something else there, a flicker of something hard, a glint of steel. "The floorboard," she whispered, her voice urgent, pointing a shaking finger toward the foot of her cot. "Under the rug, there's a loose board." Jedediah frowned, confused. He knelt, pulled back the small, threadbare rug, and found it instantly. He pried the board up. In the small, dark space below, wrapped in oilcloth, was a Schofield revolver and a box of cartridges. It was his service revolver. He hadn't seen it in 9 years. He'd hidden it there on his first day in this cabin, a final act of burying his past. How could she possibly know it was there? There was no time to ask. The first gunshot splintered the wood of his front door. The siege had begun. Jedediah snatched the revolver, the familiar weight of it in his hand a grim comfort. He checked its load. Full. He tucked it into his belt and took his rifle to the window. He didn't want to kill them. Violence was a fire that once started consumed everything, but he would not let them have her. He had made his choice when he carried her over his threshold. "Last chance, old man!" Kane yelled. Jedediah sighted down the barrel of his rifle. He didn't aim for Kane, but for the rock just beside his horse's head. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle boomed, the sound echoing across the crags. The bullet sparked off the rock and Kane's horse reared violently, throwing him into the mud. His 2 men immediately opened fire, their shots peppering the front of the cabin. Jedediah ducked below the window, wood splinters showering his head. He crawled to the other side of the room, to a small shuttered opening he used for ventilation. It gave him an angle on their flank. He pushed the shutter open a crack. One of the men was reloading, his back to him. Jedediah aimed for his shoulder. A disabling shot. A warning. He fired again. The man cried out, dropping his pistol and stumbling back behind cover. "He's flanking us!" The remaining man shouted. "Just rush the door, you idiot!" Kane bellowed, pulling himself from the mud, his face a mask of fury. The last man did as he was told, charging the front door with his shoulder down. Jedediah spun around, knowing the old wood wouldn't hold against a determined assault. The door shuddered, the bolt groaning. Suddenly, a new sound. A high-pitched, piercing whistle from Alara's lips. It cut through the noise of the fight like a razor. For a split second, everyone froze. The man at the door hesitated. Kane looked up, confused. In that moment of hesitation, Alara, with her one good arm, hurled the heavy iron skillet from the hearth. It flew through the air and smashed against the cabin's single window, shattering the glass in the frame. The man outside flinched at the sudden explosion of sound, turning his head instinctively. It was all the opening Jedediah needed. He kicked the front door open from the inside, slamming it into the charging man and sending him sprawling backward. Jedediah stepped out onto the porch, rifle at his hip, the cold rain on his face. He leveled the barrel at Kane Blackwood. The one remaining goon, his shoulder bleeding, raised his pistol. But before he could fire, Jedediah's old Schofield was in his hand, roaring to life. The shot was perfect, hitting the man's gun and sending it flying from his grasp. He stared at his empty, stinging hand in disbelief. Now it was just him and Kane. The rich man's son stood in the mud, his fine clothes ruined, his face contorted in a snarl of disbelief and wounded pride. His pistol was still in its holster. He was fast. Jedediah knew the type, but he was angry, and angry men are sloppy. "You're a dead man," Kane spat, his hand hovering over the butt of his gun. "Maybe," Jedediah said, his voice flat and cold, "but not today, and not by you. Take your wounded and get off my mountain. Don't come back." For a long second, the world held its breath. Kane's eyes darted from Jedediah's rifle to the Schofield in his other hand, then to his two disarmed and injured men. The odds had changed. Pride warred with survival on his face. Survival won. With a final venomous glare, he turned without another word, helped his men onto their horses, and rode away, the sound of their retreat swallowed by the rain. Silence descended, broken only by the dripping of water from the eaves of the cabin. Jedediah stood there for a long moment, the rifle and the revolver feeling like extensions of his own arms. The cold fury began to recede, leaving behind the familiar, hollow ache. He turned and went back inside. Ilara was leaning against the wall, pale and trembling, but her eyes held a fire he hadn't seen before. "That whistle," he said, bolting the broken door as best he could. "And the skillet. You bought me the time I needed." She gave a weak, shaky nod. "I couldn't just lie there." He looked at her, then down at the Schofield still in his hand, and then back at her. The question that had been pushed aside by the violence now returned, more urgent than ever. "How did you know where I kept my gun?" Ilara took a deep breath, the fire in her eyes banking into something else, something calculated. The trembling victim was gone, replaced by a woman who seemed to be weighing her next words with immense care. "Because this isn't an accident, Jedediah," she said, her voice steady and clear. "My running, my getting injured, even the fight with Kane, it wasn't all as it seemed. I didn't just stumble upon your cabin. I was looking for it." Jedediah stared at her, his mind struggling to process her words. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "What are you talking about?" "I know who you are, or rather, who you were," she said, her gaze unwavering. "I read the old service records. I studied the reports from the Black Creek Massacre. I know what you did to the Clayton gang when they took those hostages at the bank in '78. I was looking for a ghost, a legend. I was looking for Marshal Jedediah Kane." He felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. No one had called him by that name in a decade. He had buried that man, buried him deeper than the grave he was digging outside. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Because Kane was just the vanguard," she said, her expression hardening. "He's an animal, but he's a stupid animal. His father, Silas Blackwood, is the real snake. He isn't just a cattle baron. He's been buying up all the land in the valley, forcing people out, using strong-arm tactics and fear. My family was the last holdout. This marriage was his final move to seize our property. But it's more than that. We have evidence, Jedediah. Ledgers. Proof that he's been working with railroad bandits, robbing his own rivals' shipments and building his empire on blood." She pushed herself off the wall, her good hand clenched into a fist. "I ran to you because I needed more than a hiding place. I needed a fortress, and I needed a soldier to help me defend it. Kane's pursuit wasn't just to get his bride back. It was to get those ledgers. They're sewn into the hem of this dress." Jedediah felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. His sanctuary, his prison of solitude, hadn't been a random haven. It had been selected. It was a strategic asset. He wasn't a savior. He was a tool. A wave of anger and betrayal washed over him. "You used me. You brought this war to my doorstep. I brought you a chance to be the man you used to be," she countered, her voice ringing with a desperate conviction, "to do some good instead of just waiting to die." Before he could answer, a low, rumbling sound echoed from the valley below. It wasn't thunder. He moved to the broken window, his heart pounding a heavy, dreadful rhythm against his ribs. Ilara came to stand beside him. The storm had finally broken, and the morning sun was cutting through the last of the clouds. The valley floor, shrouded in mist just moments ago, was now terribly clear, and down there, at the base of the path leading up his mountain, was a sight that made his blood run cold. It wasn't 3 men, it was 30, a small army of riders, armed to the teeth, fanning out in a disciplined line. And at their head, on a pristine white horse, sat a grim older man whose face was the very picture of cold, calculating authority. Silas Blackwood. Kane had not been the attack. He had been the scout. He was sent to test the defenses, and they had failed the test by revealing their full strength. Jedediah looked around his small, vulnerable cabin. He looked at the woman beside him, her desperate plan now collapsing around them both. His fortress had just become a trap, and they were the bait. Jedediah's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of old bones. He saw the cold geometry of it all. 30 men, maybe more. An execution squad. Kane had been the probe, the bloody finger testing the strength of the door, and in their desperate, valiant defense, they had shown him exactly what he came to see. One old man and a wounded woman. A bitter laugh escaped his throat, a dry, rattling sound. He looked at Alara, whose face had drained of all its newfound fire, leaving only the pale ash of despair. "So that's it," he said, his voice flat. "You didn't just bring me a stray, you brought me a war." "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. I believed the legend of Marshal Kane was enough. I thought the name alone would make them think twice." "Legends don't stop bullets, girl," he grunted, turning from the window. His mind, however, was already working. The old part of his brain, the part that saw tactical problems instead of insurmountable odds, was firing back to life. He was no longer a man digging a grave. He was a man assessing a battlefield.
"Old man,
tell me about the mountain,"
you can't
he
hide
said,
in there forever.
his
Show
tone
yourself."
shifting, becoming sharp, focused. "The path you took. Are there other ways up?" Alara shook her head, her eyes wide with confusion at his sudden change. "No, just the one main trail. It's too steep otherwise, all cliffs and shale." "Good," he nodded, more to himself than to her. He walked the perimeter of the small cabin, his hand trailing along the rough-hewn logs. He was seeing it not as a home, but as a fortification. One door, 2 windows, a stone chimney. Vulnerable, terribly vulnerable. "They won't rush us," he said, thinking aloud. "Not 30 men up a narrow path. Silas is arrogant, but he's not stupid. He'll lay siege, try to starve us out or draw us out." He stopped and looked at her, his gaze intense. The anger was gone, replaced by a grim resignation. A duty he had tried to outrun for 9 years had finally cornered him. "They're your father's ledgers," he said, his voice low. "But this is my mountain." He is not taking either. For the next hour, as the sun climbed higher, they worked. A strange, silent partnership forged in the crucible of impending doom. He gave the orders, and she, despite her broken arm and the agony it caused her, obeyed without question. She tore strips from the remaining blankets, fetched rope from a dusty chest, and listened with rapt attention as he explained his plan, a desperate thin thread of a strategy. Jedediah moved with an energy that belied his years. He was outside now, moving amongst the rocks and pines that surrounded his cabin, a ghost in his own yard. He worked with rope and strategically placed logs, creating a deadfall trap on a narrow section of the trail 50 yards below the cabin. He loosened a massive boulder perched precariously above the path, securing it with a single, thick rope tied to a pine tree near his porch. A final, desperate measure. He looked down at the valley. The town of Harmony Creek was a collection of miniature buildings, deceptively peaceful from this height. He could see Blackwood's men, dismounted, making camp. They were settling in, confident in their overwhelming numbers. They owned the valley, and they believed they owned the mountain too. Jedediah knew the people of that town. He had, a lifetime ago, been their shield. He remembered them as good, hard-working folk, but fear was a poison that could paralyze the strongest heart. Silas Blackwood had been feeding them that poison for years. They would not help. They would bolt their doors, shutter their windows, and pray the trouble on the mountain stayed on the mountain. He and Alara were utterly alone. He returned to the cabin as the sun reached its zenith. The air was still and heavy with anticipation. "It's done," he said, checking his rifle in the Schofield one last time. "Now we wait." The waiting was the hardest part. The silence stretched, taut and thin. Every gust of wind sounded like an approaching army. Every bird call was a signal. Alara sat by the hearth, her face pale, the ledger-filled dress a constant, grim reminder of what was at stake. The attack came in the late afternoon, not a full assault, but a probing force. 6 men, moving carefully up the trail, using the rocks for cover. Jedediah watched them from the window, his breath held steady. He let them get close. He waited until the lead man was almost at the deadfall. He whistled sharply, a signal to Ilara. She was ready. With her one good hand, she pulled a small rock from a pile they had made by the door and threw it against a hanging piece of scrap metal he'd put up. The sharp clang echoed down the trail. The men flinched, looking up toward the cabin, distracted for a single, fatal second. In that second, Jedediah fired the rifle, not at the men, but at the small, frayed rope holding his trap together. The shot was perfect. The rope snapped. With a groan of splintering wood, a half-dozen heavy logs cascaded down onto the path. The men yelled in panic, scrambling back as the avalanche of timber crashed down, blocking the trail completely. Two were not fast enough. Their cries were cut short. The others opened fire, a wild, inaccurate volley that chewed up the logs of the cabin. Jedediah was already moving, crawling to the other window, the Schofield in his hand. He fired twice, his shots kicking up dirt at the feet of the remaining men, forcing them back. It was a message. This far and no farther. They got the message. They retreated, dragging their wounded with them, leaving the trail blocked and their pride shattered. A small victory, but it had cost them. They had revealed their traps, and they were still 30-2. Down below, Silas Blackwood would have seen it all. Jedediah knew the man's type. This setback wouldn't discourage him. It would enrage him. The next wave would be bigger, more determined. As dusk began to settle, casting long purple shadows across the valley, a new development occurred. A single rider broke from Blackwood's camp and rode hard toward Harmony Creek. "He's sending for supplies," Ilara said, her voice strained. "Or more men." "Let him," Jedediah said, though his own hope was a flickering candle flame. He watched the rider disappear between the first buildings of the town that had locked its doors. And then, something strange happened. Or rather, nothing happened. The rider did not return. An hour passed, then two. The sun dipped below the western peaks, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red. Still, the rider did not return. Jedediah frowned, a knot of confusion tightening in his gut. He peered down at Harmony Creek. The streets were empty. No lights appeared in the windows as darkness fell. It was as if the town itself had died. A ghost town. "What is happening?" Ilara whispered, sensing his unease. "I don't know," Jedediah admitted. "It's too quiet, even for a town that's scared." Silas Blackwood must have thought so too. He sent two more riders. They too rode into the silent streets of Harmony Creek. And they too did not return. A palpable tension now rose from the camp below. Jedediah could see men gesturing, arguing. Their confidence was eroding, being replaced by a creeping dread. The mountain was hostile. The town was a void. They were isolated. The truth of it dawned on Jedediah slowly, a sunrise of impossible hope. He remembered the faces of the townsfolk from 9 years ago. The blacksmith, Thomas, whose father had stood with him against the Clayton gang. The baker's wife, Maria, who had given him water. The quiet sheriff, who was a good man but easily intimidated. They were cowed, yes, but maybe they weren't broken. "They're not hiding," Jedediah breathed, a profound awe in his voice. He looked at Ilara, a wild, unbelievable idea taking root. "They're not cowering. They're fighting." He didn't know how. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. It was the deep, indrawn breath before a roar. His theory was proven at dawn. Enraged and unnerved, Silas Blackwood made his move. He wasn't a patient man. He sent the bulk of his force, 20 men, up the mountain. It was a brute force assault. They cleared the deadfall trap with axes and brute strength, their progress slow but steady. Jedediah and Ilara held them off as best they could. From the windows they laid down suppressing fire, forcing the attackers to stay behind cover, making every foot of ground a struggle. Jedediah's shots were precise, aimed at rocks and trees, a symphony of ricochets designed to intimidate and confuse. But it was a losing battle. They were a wall of water against a rising tide. The attackers reached the final 50 yards, the open ground before the cabin. They were gathering for a final rush. Jedediah looked at the thick rope tied to the pine tree, the rope that held back the giant boulder. It was his last card to play. "Get ready," he said to Ilara. But before he could give the order, a sound drifted up from the valley. It was faint at first, then grew louder. The rhythmic, powerful clang of a hammer striking an anvil. One single defiant beat, then another, and another. It was a signal. Jedediah looked down. The sight that met his eyes would be burned into his memory forever. The road leading out of the valley, Blackwood's only escape route, was being blocked. From every storefront, every alley, the people of Harmony Creek were emerging. They weren't carrying guns. They were carrying their lives. They rolled wagons into the street. They dragged plows, barrels, and furniture. And at the head of them all was the blacksmith, Thomas, a massive man with arms like tree trunks. He rolled his heavy anvil into the very center of the road, a look of grim, unbreakable resolve on his face. Behind him the sheriff stood, his tin star pinned to his chest, holding a shotgun not with fear, but with newfound purpose. The women and children were there too, forming a silent human wall. They were not an army. They were something far more powerful. They were a community that had found its soul. Down at the base of the mountain, Silas Blackwood watched, his face a mask of apoplectic fury. His escape was cut off. His authority, built on fear, was being defied by the very people he despised. "Burn it!" he roared to his men on the mountain, his voice carrying up to the cabin. "Burn them out! I want those ledgers!" The attackers didn't need to be told twice. One of them ran forward with a lit torch, hurling it onto the dry roof of the cabin. The old wood caught instantly. Flames began to lick up the side of the roof, smoke pouring into the small space. "Out!" Jedediah yelled, grabbing Alara. "Now!" He kicked the broken door open, and they stumbled out into the morning light, coughing, their eyes streaming. The attackers raised their rifles, cornering them. It was over. But Jedediah wasn't looking at them. He was looking past them, at Silas Blackwood, who was now riding up the trail alone, his face alight with triumph. Kane followed just behind him, a smug, vicious grin on his face. "Marshal Kane," Silas sneered, dismounting. "I should have known. They say you can't kill a ghost. Seems they're wrong. Give me the ledgers and I'll give your lady friend a quick end." Jedediah stood tall, the Schofield still clutched in his hand. He looked at the burning cabin, his home for 9 years, his tomb, now a funeral pyre. He felt no sadness, only a cold, clarifying rage. "The town has you trapped, Silas," Jedediah said, his voice calm. "That rabble?" Silas laughed. "They'll scatter the moment my men turn their guns on them. They have no stomach for a real fight. Now, the ledgers." "You want the ledgers?" Alara's voice rang out, clear and steady. She stepped forward, her green eyes blazing. "Then you'll have to listen to them first." And she began to speak. In a loud, unwavering voice, she recited the first entry. October 14th, 1881. Payment to Cole Younger for the derailment of the Union Pacific shipment. $500 in gold coin. A murmur went through Blackwood's men. They were hired guns, but they weren't stupid. Robbing the railroad was a federal crime. "Silence her!" Silas shrieked at Kane. Kane drew his pistol and took a step toward Alara. But before he could take a second, a booming voice echoed from the trail behind him. "I don't think so, Mr. Blackwood." It was Thomas, the blacksmith. He had walked up the mountain path alone, carrying his massive smithing hammer over his shoulder. He was not a gunslinger. He was something older, something more fundamental. He was a citizen defending his home. "This is between him and me," Thomas said, his eyes locked on Silas. "You took my father's ranch. You broke him. You will not break this valley. Not anymore." That single act of courage was a spark in a tinderbox. Blackwood's men looked at each other, their loyalty, bought with coin, now wavering in the face of a truth they could not deny. They looked at the burning cabin, at the determined woman, at the unyielding blacksmith, and at the ghost of a marshal who stood before them, unbreakable. They were on the wrong side of this fight, and they knew it. Silas saw it too. He saw his empire of fear crumbling. In a final, desperate act, he drew his own pistol and aimed it at Jedediah. "To hell with all of you." He never fired the shot. Jedediah's Schofield barked once. The bullet struck the pistol in Silas's hand, sending it spinning into the dirt. Silas cried out, clutching his shattered fingers. At that exact moment, another group of riders appeared on the trail. They were not townsfolk. They wore the uniforms of United States Marshals, led by a grim-faced man with a silver star that glinted in the sunlight. The sheriff, it turned out, had not just found his courage. He had used it. One of the riders who had disappeared into the town had been sent not for supplies, but for the law, riding a relay horse through the back trails the sheriff had told him about. The standoff was over. The siege was broken. Justice, when it came, was swift and absolute. With the ledgers as irrefutable proof and the testimony of half the town, Silas Blackwood and his son were arrested, their reign of terror over. Their hired guns surrendered without a fight, eager to testify in exchange for leniency. In the days that followed, the valley came back to life. The sound of hammers was no longer a signal for war, but for rebuilding. The people, their fear broken, worked together with a unity they hadn't known in years. Jedediah stood with Alara on the mountain, looking at the charred remains of his cabin. Everything he owned was gone, and yet he felt richer than he had in a decade. "What will you do now?" Alara asked softly. The splint was off her arm, replaced by a proper sling fashioned by the town doctor. Jedediah walked over to the grave he had spent weeks digging. He looked into it for a long moment, at the perfect, empty space he had carved for his own misery. Then he picked up the shovel he had thrown down what felt like a lifetime ago. With a grunt, he began to push the dark, rich earth back into the hole, burying the ghost of the man he had been. "My cabin may be gone," he said, not pausing in his work, "but this is still my mountain. And that," he said, nodding toward Harmony Creek below, "is my town. I reckon they might need a man who knows how to keep the peace." He wasn't Marshall Kane anymore, the legend haunted by his past. And he wasn't the hermit, hiding from the world. He was just Jedediah. And for the first time in 9 long years, that was more than enough. He looked at the town, alive and bustling under the wide western sky, and felt the quiet strength of a man who had finally come home. And so they proved that the courage of one can indeed ignite the strength of many, turning a valley of fear into a beacon of hope. The spirit of the West lives on in tales like these. To hear more stories of unlikely heroes and the communities they inspire, subscribe to our channel and become a guardian of their legacy.